Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we descend into the labyrinth of legend to follow the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, a tale of courage, cunning, and destiny. But before you drift into comfort, I ask you as a fellow knight of these tales to like and subscribe, and in the comments, share what legends or myths you would have us explore next. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Tribute's Shadow. The message reached Theseus while he stood in the palace courtyard, where the stone kept the late light and the day settled into quieter chores. A herald from the harbour had climbed the steps, and he carried a scroll, and the guards already knew the ink meant names were being taken again. Theseus listened without moving, because the words followed the same old path through Athens, and he wanted to understand where that path truly led. The herald said the year had turned, and King Minos expected the tribute, and Athens was to send young men and young women across the sea. He spoke of lots to be drawn, of families to be told, of a voyage that carried sorrow packed as tightly as the food jars. People standing nearby kept their eyes low because they had seen this before, and the years kept marking the same hard tally on the city. Theseus heard the words and considered the faces the herald did not name yet, and that was enough to set his mind along one direction. He had grown in the house of King Aegeus, but he remembered other roads and instruction, and he recognized how burdens gathered without a hand to lift them. Theseus looked toward the harbour and thought of Crete, and he did not imagine heroics, only a job that someone in Athens finally needed to do. He waited for the herald to finish, and he kept his place, and the day quietly turned toward evening, while the city sank into the known trouble. In those years, Athens sat under a fixed demand, and the calendar of the city bent itself around the day the ship would leave. King Aegeus kept the throne, but he also kept the memory of old trouble with Crete, and he lived careful with the bargain that followed. Minos ruled across the water, and he sent demands rather than armies, and that was its own kind of pressure because refusal had already proven costly before. The story said his son Androgeus had died in Athens, and Minos had taken his anger and shaped it into a rule that did not ease. Every year 7 young men and 7 young women left for Crete, and the count had become a mark families knew how to dread. They were sent into a maze under Knossos, where a creature waited, and the creature had a name people tried not to say too loudly at home. The Minotaur was said to be half man and half bull, and the stories gave it such heavy sighs that simple fear stayed with listeners. At the port, the crews patched timbers and sealed seams, and the smell of hot pitch rose while they worked with steady hands. Athens counted days by the marketplace, by harvest, and by this departure, and people learned to keep their voices level when the counting reached that mark. Theseus watched how the city carried the rule, and he kept note of the plain habits people used to stand the weight without breaking. He saw the pattern, and he understood patterns could be changed if a person chose to meet the hardest part rather than skirt around it. Theseus was young, broad in the shoulders, and careful with his words because his mother had taught him to listen before he set his jaw. He had travelled from Troxon to Athens to know his father, and he had found King Aegeus cautious, tiring in the face of too much grief. Aegeus carried a city on his shoulders, and he carried the old stories of gods, and that made him slower to gamble with what remained. Minos lived across the sea, older and certain, and his certainty pressed on Athens because power often walked strongest when it did not need to appear daily. The heralds were practical men, and they wore plain cloaks, and they kept names, tallies, and instructions that made their steps feel heavier with each season. The youths chosen were not chosen for any flaw, and that point mattered, because Athens understood this as a rule of chance rather than judgment. Parents folded clothes into travel bundles, sisters tied knots in cords, and friends spoke small and ordinary encouragements that came out thin at the edge. Theseus kept company with the young men in the wrestling yard, and he watched them try strength, and he measured his own without showing any hunger to boast. He spoke to them by name, and they answered him by name, and the talk stayed plain, because power that listened made space for steadiness. In the palace, Aegeus kept counselors close, and they muttered of alliances and risks, and the air smelled faintly of oil from the lamps. Aegeus walked through that talk and remained quiet until he was sure, because a promise liked to sit on firm ground before it met the wind. When the day for drawing lots approached, Aegeus moved among the officials and asked direct questions, and he kept the answers in order like stones in a line. The priests confirmed the count, the heralds prepared the names, and the city agreed to follow the same plain ritual it had followed every other year. Theseus met elders who remembered the first time, and they spoke of Minos landing with ships, and they told how negotiation had hardened into the rule. He heard the name Androgeus again, and he heard about envy, contests, and blame, and he understood how a single death had been used to bind many lives. Theseus visited a family whose daughter might be chosen, and he sat on a stool, and he let the father and mother speak until their voices slowed. He did not promise anything then, because he did not want to make comfort that would fail, though he wrote the look of them in his memory. At the sanctuary of Apollo, he left a small offering, and asked no sign, because it seemed better to choose with clear eyes than wait on omens. We keep the pace steady here because the steps mattered. Theseus listened, Theseus walked, Theseus saw, and then Theseus began to say what he would do. He told a small circle of friends that he meant to end the tribute, and the friends heard the tone and understood he had already started. The guards at the gate saw him speak with the herald and the high steward, and they exchanged looks familiar to men who recognized a task shaping itself. By evening Theseus stood by the water, and the breeze off the strait cooled his forearms, and he knew the line of his path would cross the sea. The next morning Theseus went to King Aegeus, and he asked for the right to place his name among those who would sail to Crete. Aegeus heard him, and Aegeus set his hands on the arms of the chair, and the motion showed the old man weighing care against need. Aegeus explained himself in plain terms, saying the tribute would continue unless someone accepted the burden, and he believed he was shaped for that kind of work. Aegeus spoke of risk, and he spoke of fathers and sons, and he asked for time, which was the only coin a worried king could still spend. Aegeus agreed to wait a day, and he left the room, and the guards noticed the quiet way his steps measured the length of the hall. The news reached the marketplace by noon, and traders repeated it between exchanges, and the sound of it thinned as it moved outward through the lanes. People used the name Theseus when they spoke, and then they used he, and it sounded simpler each time because a clear decision helped other things line up. Here is the small recap that keeps our thread in hand. Theseus learned of the tribute, Theseus asked questions, and Theseus told the king his intention. By evening Aegeus called for him again, and the old man's voice held tired love, and permission was given with conditions that would be spoken more fully soon. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later, because the city had seen a prince accept a hard piece of his city's work. The Theseus left the palace and walked through the courtyard, and he turned the talk over in his mind, and the course he set had become real. The city settled for the night, and Theseus sat in a quiet room with a low flame, and he let his thoughts move without hurry. He remembered his mother, he remembered the road to Athens, and he remembered each step that had brought him to a house where the king knew his name. Theseus considered the Minotaur as a task rather than a nightmare, because tasks could be faced, and nightmares tended to shrink when someone made steady plans. He thought also of Minos, and he measured that king in simple terms, as a man who guarded pride and order, and who relied on obedience from others. Aegeus sat awake in another room, and the old man looked over the lists again, and his finger paused on the name he had allowed onto the page. Servants moved lightly through the corridors, and they closed doors, and the night kept its simple work of carrying one day into the next while the city breathed. Theseus set a bundle by the doorway, and he placed a cord beside it, and he allowed himself to think of the young people who would be chosen. He planned not with flourish but with order, noting what to say, whom to speak with, and how to keep the group together when the day arrived. The tribute had cast its shadow over Athens for years, and Theseus decided to step into that shadow, so the light behind it might reach others again. He would speak more with Aegeus in the morning, and then he would speak with those to be chosen, and the voyage's shape would begin to form. For now he closed his eyes, breathed once with patience, and trusted that slow care could carry a plan from intention to action without noise. Chapter 2. A promise of sails between father and son. Theseus stood with King Aegeus in the shaded court, and their talk had moved from rumours to decisions that would not wait. The cool shade lay across the stone paving, and eased the heat on their faces while the words kept pressing forward anyway. Theseus spoke first because he had weighed his choice, and he said he would take a place among the chosen youths. He kept his voice steady, and Theseus looked at the older man as a son looks at a father, plain and honest. Theseus heard him, and Odysseus set his hand on the carved seat beside him, steadying a heart pulled in many directions already. He had ruled long, and he had seen sacrifices made, yet the thought of Theseus boarding that ship strained the breath from him. Theseus waited through a small silence, then explained he could not carry Athens in name without carrying its pains with the same hands. He did not speak like a challenger, and Theseus did not boast, knowing that bravado would only wound a man already worn thin. Aegeus nodded at last, and Aegeus said if the choice had settled in him, then they must plan leaving and returning. He drew Aegeus close, and asked for a sign that could cross distance, a signal telling a father how to ready his heart. In the days before departure, they walked together at Phaleron, the harbour that held the tribute ship moored and waiting with its crew. The caw of gulls carried over the breakwater, a steady sound that kept their pace ordinary, and we kept company with that steadiness, while thoughts stayed heavy. Theseus asked to see the sails, because talk in the court could not settle until cloth and rope were handled in person. He watched a steward open a chest, and the black sail lay folded with its cords, a dark habit for a dark duty. Agagus stood beside him and did not reach for it, letting the steward handle it, as if distance could soften the meaning. They also brought out a white sail, kept clean and rarely used, because voyages like this rarely gave reason for a brighter sign. Theseus said he would come back beneath that lighter cloth, and the words were plain, with nothing added and nothing held back. He spoke them once, and Theseus spoke them again, because a simple promise sat stronger when the mouth learned its shape twice. Agagus repeated the terms, saying his eyes would search the returning ship and look for the colour that Theseus raised above the deck. He named the headland at Sunion and the hill above the harbour, because he knew where he would stand when the time came. They spoke then with the men who would guide the ship, because a promise needed hands to hold it, not only mouths to say it. The pilot was an older sailor named Phronios, who had a steady way of looking that matched the calm way he moved. His voice came out low and rasping, a habit from years of salt air, and the tone made careful talk feel practical instead of grand. Theseus set the plan before Phronios, and he set it before a sailkeeper named Laches, who measured cloth and watched knots with care. Agagus added a herald named Telos, because someone would need to run ahead through the city and carry news once the sails were seen. Phronios repeated the order of things, naming where the white sail would be stored and who should bring it up at the right time. Laches nodded and lifted the bright sail with both hands, then marked a cord with a twist so he could find it quickly. Theseus watched their care, and he liked that the men moved as if everything mattered, because small steps often made the larger ones possible. Agagus watched too, drawing a little closer, maybe to read their faces and see whether the promise had found a place inside them. They spoke also with the chosen youths and maidens, and the quiet in that circle asked for gentleness, so the business stayed simple. First, Aegeus said the ship would leave under the black sail, because that cloth had always gone with this journey and calmed the watching city. Then, once Crete had been faced and whatever waited there was done, Phronios would change to the white sail before rounding Sunion toward home. Theseus agreed that the sail would change only after clearing the Cretan harbour, which kept the signal clean and the risk of confusion small. Laches promised to keep the white sail dry and ready, and to teach 2 others how to lift it quickly if he were tired. Telos set a runner's route from the hill to the palace, naming each corner where a second runner would stand to take the word onward. Theseus reached for the bright cloth, and the weave felt coarse against his palm, the same rough honesty he had shown when speaking to Aegeus. He folded the edge back and looked at Phronios again, asking him to repeat the plan, not from distrust but to lock it in place. Phronios repeated it plainly, and ended with the words that Aegeus would be watching, which made the promise feel like a shared load. Aegeus added a final piece, and promised offerings to Poseidon at Sunion on the morning the ship was due near home. They closed the chest and ended the talk as well, and we kept the pace steady here, because the day for boarding had been set. On the morning of sailing, the city came to the harbour in quiet lines, and the guards kept the way open without pushing. The ropes creaked against the moorings, a small sound threading the stillness like a reminder that movement had begun. Where the hearts were ready, Theseus walked with the others, carrying his own pack, because he wanted no mark of special standing to separate him from this burden. Agagus met him by the gangplank and held his arms, not for spectacle, but because a father steadies himself with touch when words dull. Phronios stood by the stern and counted the oarsmen once more, then nodded toward Laches, who had the chest with the sails fastened. Telos had his runners in place and lingered at the edge, because the first sight of the colour would one day be his to carry. They had set a simple sign between them, black for sorrow and white for life, and everyone there understood the weight resting inside it. Theseus stepped aboard, then turned back, and told Aegeus again he would try to bring back all he could bring. Agagus touched his shoulder and said he would watch from Sunduian, adding that the gods heard plain speech when it was kept. It may not have seemed like much then, but that talk at the gangplank held a line that would stretch beyond one voyage. In later years, people remembered that morning less for speeches and more for the bargain of colours, because simple marks outlived longer phrases. Agaios had asked for a sign he could trust from a distance, and Theseus had given it plainly, tying return to a single changeable thing. It showed how families worked their courage, leaning on small arrangements that sailors could honour and watchers on the shore could recognise at once. Theseus understood that, and he met care with care, giving Phronios and Laches their steps, so the burden never sat on one neck. Agaios understood it too, and he knew his own strength depended on that cloth, which was a modest truth rather than something to hide. The horizon lay pale and even beyond the harbour mouth, and that thin line made the city feel held close and stretched toward what waited. They had not left yet in this telling. Though the hour had come, because the shape of leaving deserved its place before motion took over. Theseus kept the promise in his thoughts like another piece of gear, something to check and hold, as a traveller checks a latch. Aegeus kept it too, and he felt steadier knowing that work had been shared among men whose names could be counted on. So the chapter of the sails closed with care, and the business of open water waited next, patient, quiet, and ready to follow the line. Chapter 3. Among the Chosen, on the Aegean. The ship moved in an even line, and the timbers creaked as if keeping time with the breaths of those aboard. Theseus stood among the chosen youths, not apart from them, and he watched the horizon as if it were a steady teacher. He had left plans behind on the shore, yet he carried the purpose in his body, and he kept it simple for himself. Theseus thought of the Minotaur without ornament as a task waiting at the end of water, and the thought did not drift away. He spoke a few quiet words to Damon and Ione. Then he stepped back so they could sit and hold their thoughts close. Theseus did not crowd their feelings because he knew fear had its own pace, and he respected the time it needed to settle. He counted the oar strokes in sets, and he broke the day into pieces, and that helped him measure how close they drew to Crete. Theseus looked once toward the stern where the helmsman kept the rudder firm, and he nodded without asking anything further from the man. He let the work of the sea carry them, and he kept his promise steady inside his chest by deliberate breath and simple words. Theseus remained quiet for the most part, because the group needed a calm figure, and because the voyage itself did the talking with its pace. In the first days after leaving Sunium behind, the sea lanes opened, and the islands lay like markers they could count. The sail cast a wide shadow across the deck, and that shade drew a square where the youths gathered for quiet talk. Theseus marked the mornings by the length of that shape, and he told Nico and Clea how he used little measures to stay steady. He had a way of breaking worry into steps, and he shared it plainly, not to instruct but to ease how tight the air felt around them. Theseus listened more than he spoke, letting Damon tell a small story from his mother, and letting Ione nod without needing to add more. He kept the direction of the ship in view, not as a distraction but as a reminder that movement itself carried them toward a fixed end. Theseus noted how the captain Phorbus checked the weather signs with careful glances, and he respected the man without trying to lead his work. He moved between groups one at a time, and he made sure names were used, because names held people in place when fear made them float. Theseus returned often to the bow and watched the path ahead, and he kept his shoulders low so others did not feel pushed. It may not have seemed like much then, but those small habits made a circle of calm that held when their thoughts grew sharp. The chosen youths were not the same in age or size, and each carried a different reason for being there, yet they shared the same passage. Theseus learnt their names and repeated them gently, so Damon, Ione, Nico, and Clea felt themselves counted rather than stacked inside a grim tally. He saw how Damon kept watch for any sign of home, and how Ione made lists in her head, and he let them keep those patterns. Theseus spoke with Phorbus about provisions and water, and he shook hands with the old helmsman Menes, who understood currents better than talk. He met a small priest of Apollo who carried a reed flute, and he thanked the man for a blessing given without demand or show. Theseus noticed how the oarsmen saved their strength by small changes in rhythm, and he filed it away as another kind of endurance worth learning. He practiced knotting a line with Nico in the afternoons, and the rope felt rough in their hands as they took turns and grinned at mistakes. Theseus kept conversation on ordinary ground, about bread, about sleep, and about who would clean the deck, and that made the large fear shrink a little. He did not promise outcomes because that would have been empty talk, yet he promised his effort, and he said it the same way each day. Theseus held the idea of the Minotaur as the center they all moved toward, and he did not let it become more or less than it was. Days arranged themselves in a plain order, and Theseus kept that order as a net they could rely on while the sea stayed kind. First he checked with Phorbus about course and speed. Then he walked the deck and greeted each youth by name so they felt seen at the start. He set small tasks, like coiling lines, measuring water jars, and clearing the walkway, and he shifted the pairs so no one stayed alone too long. Theseus then took a length of line and showed how to hold it without tangling, and he explained how staying linked helped people move through tight places. He had heard talk of a maze under Konos, and he did not play it up, yet he kept the idea present as a simple problem of direction. Theseus practiced counting steps with them in 4s and 8s, and he paused often so the pattern sank in, and no one felt rushed or shamed. He took a wooden staff and went through slow drills for balance and grip, and he invited Damon to try, then he let Ione guide the next set. Theseus listened to the oarlocks clicking softly during the afternoon pull, and he matched his breaths to the rhythm, letting the movement settle the ship. He spoke in the evenings about how they would walk together when the time came, with short lines of words they could recall without strain. Theseus noted how day gave way to night and back again in even turns, and he let that steady exchange carry its own calm lesson. The group grew used to the pace, and even the uneasy sleepers found short stretches of rest that added up to something they could use. Theseus saw Damon take the knot work without prompting, and he watched Ione correct Nico kindly, and he knew the small skills were doing their part. He kept the Minotaur in mind as the reason for all this, and he repeated that reason in plain terms so no one mistook the purpose. Theseus began to speak of arriving without dressing it up, saying they would go ashore, they would be taken in, and they would wait for the appointed time. He made a plan for what to say and what not to say when officials met them, and he made sure each name would be heard clearly. Theseus stood at the bow one afternoon and pointed at a pale line on the horizon, and the coastline showed itself as if drawing nearer by thought. He told them not to hurry their minds ahead of their feet, and he reminded them that routines would still serve when the harbour took them in. Theseus settled each worry that rose, not by fixing everything, but by setting the next step, and that kept the day workable and honest. So the crossing held steady, and Theseus kept the Minotaur in his thoughts while he taught the group to hold together without noise. It seemed quiet from the outside, but it set their footing for what waited in Knossos, and soon the palace would stand in view. That night the ship trimmed its course a point south, and a small lantern swayed near the stern as Menes kept his hands steady on the tiller. Theseus leaned against the rail and thought briefly of Aegeus, not to stir sorrow but to mark the thread of promise that tied shore to sea. He did not linger in memory, because the people beside him needed his present attention, and he chose to be useful where his feet stood. Theseus counted his breaths again, and he let them clear the last bits of restlessness, and he found the same simple resolve he had set from the start. He said a few ordinary words to Clea about sleep and waking watches, and then he spoke with Phorbus about arriving at dawn or later if winds shifted. Theseus reminded himself that the Minotaur was a living danger, not a tale, and that facing it would begin with walking forward in an orderly way. He did not make himself into a hero in his mind, since that would only add weight, and he kept instead to the plan of steady work. He thought once more about the land ahead, not with eagerness, but with readiness, and he felt the group settle around him in quiet trust. He understood that crossings often did their real work in silence, and that this one had shaped them into companions rather than separate shadows. He rested for a short while, then rose again to check names and places in his head, and the voyage moved gently toward its end. Chapter 4. Ariadne's quiet gift guards led the Athenian youths across the broad court of Knossos, while Theseus kept his step even and his thoughts fixed on the maze. Ariadne watched from a shaded colonnade, seeing how the others faltered while he looked forward, and she understood the difference at once. She had heard the stories of Athens and the promise of sails, and she read purpose in his jaw and in his careful pace. Theseus glanced toward the columns, and Ariadne, seeing the look meet hers for an instant, stepped down with the quick decision she often used. One guard, a seasoned man named Philemon, hesitated when the princess raised her hand, then nodded because Minos' daughter had that right. She came closer and spoke a simple welcome to Crete, and Theseus answered with courtesy that carried no begging and no boast. The group of youths clustered near the far wall while the officials argued about quarters, and that left the two of them a pocket of quiet. Ariadne asked his name although she already knew it, and Theseus said it plainly, then waited because he sensed she had more to say. She said there was a path that did not rely on luck or pride, and he listened, weighing the turn of her words for their truth. The stones held the day's heat underfoot, and before the sun slid behind the palace roofs, Ariadne told him she would speak again in the evening, and Theseus agreed without fuss. That afternoon shaped itself slowly in the palace, where errands ran along the corridors and stewards marked schedules while guards checked torches and doors. Beyond the great courtyard lay passages that turned inward, and beneath them, hidden from the map of daily life, stretched the labyrinth Daedalus had built. Ariadne moved among servants with the ease of someone known in every room, and she chose a quiet storeroom by a side stair for the meeting. Theseus waited in a small antechamber assigned to the captives, knowing that every step he took would be watched once the lamps were lit. The princess sent a message with a kitchen boy who was used to errands, and the boy spoke a single word that let Theseus stand and follow. They walked without hurry, taking the longer path because short routes drew questions, and they came to the place as the light thinned. A single guard kept his back turned to give them space, which was a quiet kind of loyalty that Ariadne never misused. Around them the palace settled into its evening rhythm, and the talk of the day slipped downward into the calmer tones of routine and rest. Through the open shutters came the faint salt smell from the sea, a reminder that ships waited below the cliff and that time moved forward. It may not have seemed like much then, but that hour mattered, because it set their talk away from the court and closer to the truth. Ariadne stood without ornament, only a plain belt at her waist, and she spoke in the careful way of someone used to responsibility. Theseus, taller than most and strong through the shoulders, kept his voice level, and he answered each point as if he were laying stones in a line. She named the danger by its parts, saying the Minotaur waited at the center, and saying the way there was a tangle meant to turn courage into wandering. She named Daedalus too. Not as a hero, but as a builder whose mind made doors where others saw blank walls, and whose turns did not repeat. From her sleeve, Ariadne drew a small coil of fine wool thread, held on a wooden peg, and in her other hand she showed a short bronze blade. Theseus let his look rest on the thread first, understanding that a line held the promise of return more surely than any boast of strength. He accepted the blade as well because promises needed teeth, yet his hand closed longer around the thread before he slid it into his tunic. The thread felt a little rough where it crossed his palm, which told him it would bite into the stones when pulled tight and stay where it lay. Ariadne said the coil would reach the heart if he set it right, and she warned that the labyrinth punished hurry more than it punished fright. Theseus agreed that his steps would be counted, and he said her care for detail matched the work he would need to finish the task. They laid out the plan piece by piece, first agreeing that Theseus would tie the thread to a door ring at the labyrinth entrance where the guards rarely glanced. Then he would pay the line out with his left hand, keeping slack from tangling, and he would set it against the wall whenever the corner allowed. He would not run unless forced, because running in those passages turned quick breath into panic, and panic fed the maze in ways that felt like thought. At each turning he would pause, listen for space rather than sound, and choose the path that descended because the builder liked depth more than height. If the guards pressed him, he would lean into a stumble to gain distance, and if a stone marker offered a crest, he would lay the thread beneath it. For the Minotaur itself, Ariadne explained what hunters had told her, saying the creature charged straight when angered, and left its side open when it lowered its head. Theseus listened and said he would hold to the wall and step aside at the last half pace, then drive the blade into the neck where breath gathered. If that failed, he would use weight rather than fury, turn the horns with his grip, and keep his feet until the grip of the ground took the monster's balance. A small lamp burned on a shelf and cast a steady bar of light along the floor, and they kept their eyes low to feel the plan settle in. We keep the pace steady here, because they did, and because that calm shared between Ariadne and Theseus became the quiet center of what followed. Next they spoke of leaving, because survival inside the maze meant little if waiting hands reclaimed him at the door, and Ariadne already had a line to the harbor. She said the captain of a Cretan patrol owed her a favor, and would look away when a certain lantern shone twice from the eastern stair. Theseus nodded and said that his Athenian companions could walk if led, and she promised that a servant woman named Mira would guide them with a cloak and a quiet word. Ariadne added one more piece, asking that he take her with him, and Theseus, hearing the plain resolve in her voice, answered that he would. They agreed on a time just before dawn after the trial, because even watchful men tired before breakfast and even stern plans bent during the grey hour. He repeated the steps so she would hear them in his order, and she repeated them back, two people taking weight from one another by speaking clearly. Earlier Theseus had sailed among the chosen youths and kept his purpose in view, and now he took on the thread, the blade, and her trust. From the open passage came the slow wash of the sea against the rocks below the cliff, steady enough to remind them that departures waited for those who reached them. They knew discovery would mean a swift end for both, yet they set that thought aside, because plans needed space and worry needed a smaller room. Soon the night would bring the door and the guards and the first knot in the line, and the next step would belong to his hands and feet. When their talk ended, Ariadne wrapped the coil again as if it were only a trinket and slipped it away, and Theseus crossed the corridors without haste. He returned to the antechamber, sat on the bench among the other youths, and let his breath come slow while the guards counted heads and closed the door. He set the blade flat beneath a loose board and tied the thread under his tunic cord, and he leaned back to let quiet gather around the choice. Ariadne walked the long route to her rooms, greeted two servants by name, and closed her door with the same steady hand she used for every duty. She looked once at the harbour lamps, then drew her curtain, and she packed a small bag because leaving required less than most people believed. Theseus thought of Aegeus and of the sails he had promised, yet he did not drift into sadness, because work stood near and work held him firm. He thought of Ariadne too, and how her care had arrived without a trumpet, and he honoured that by putting pride in order and keeping the plan simple. In the courtyard the steps slowed, and the last tray rubbed the threshold, and a hush spread through the palace as it does before hard tasks. Cool night air touched his face through the high slit of the window, and he closed his eyes long enough to fix the turns and the knots in his mind. With the blade waiting, the thread hidden, and her promise beside his own, Theseus settled into the patient place that comes before a long walk in the dark. Chapter 5. Thread the Stone Door. He stood beside the sunken door where the passages began, the thread looped to a ring, and his hand steady on the knot. Theseus looked once toward the courtyard, where Ariadne had waited before, and then he faced inward, because the time for turning back had ended. He set a small test on the cord by easing his weight away, which reassured him that the start held fast where Ariadne had tied it. Theseus tested the blade in its wrapping, settled it near his hip, and kept the length of thread arranged in his other hand. He thought briefly of Aegeus and the promise marked by sails, then set his thoughts aside, because clear steps were his best help now. Theseus had trained himself to move simply, to count his pace, and to bring large tasks down to the next clear action. He stepped over the low sill without a word, because the youths resting beyond the yard deserved peace, and the guards deserved no reason to stir. Theseus drew the first length of thread inside, counting spans with his thumb, and letting his mind settle into a plain, steady rhythm. He kept his shoulders square to the opening behind him, and turned only when the angle demanded it, because wasteful motion had no place here. Theseus stepped forward again, let the line run, and trusted the slight tension to remain, as though the doorway itself kept company through the first passage. In that first stretch, the passages ran close to the courts, then bent inward under the palace, where old footings made odd corners and tight ways. Theseus carried a small torch that Ariadne had arranged, and its wavering light held a circle ahead that stayed just enough for measured steps. He held the shaft low to spare fuel, and he cupped the base when turns tried to play tricks, because a hallway could pull a man off balance. Theseus kept the thread running straight along the floor, guiding it away from edges where a grate or stone lip might worry it into a snag. He counted his paces between doorways, because paces would still be there when markings faded, and when memory took the shortest road by mistake. Theseus kept a steady hand on the slack, and he lifted coils only when a corner required one, letting the rest lie where the line wanted. He had slipped away by arrangement from the group, with the promise that their calm would help more than any late advice thrown after him. Theseus knew that Daedalus built for change and return, not for generosity, so each reasonable step had to earn its own proof. He paused at a false run of columns arranged to mimic a choice, then moved straight, because the angles did not honor the same center as the wall. Theseus paused once, set his shoulders again, and let the path take him deeper, because forward held the work he had come to finish. The tools in hand were simple, and the people behind them had made their choices before night, so the path was set. Theseus carried Ariadne's thread, and Ariadne's thought, because she had pictured the turns even when she could not walk them beside him. He kept Daedalus in mind as a maker who liked balance and misdirection, and he tried to think as a builder rather than as a hunter. Theseus also respected the Minotaur as a living force that had learned the center by living there, and he treated that fact as a plain boundary. He wore the blade at his side, wrapped to keep it from slipping, and he resisted the urge to touch it because it would carry its part later. Theseus thought of his father's eyes at the harbour, and he let that memory settle into purpose, not weight, since burdens could twist a man's judgment. He remembered the youths by the door, and he treated his steps as their borrowed steps, because that made his choices careful without making them slow. Theseus tested the thread between finger and thumb, and noted how dry it felt, which promised it would not stretch too much when he needed it most. He understood that Daedalus had no quarrel with him, only pride in a device, so the best answer to pride would be patient attention. Theseus named each branch as he passed, gave a small name to each node of twists, and in that way he kept his own map running inside. It may not have seemed important then, but names steadied things. The first turn led him along a wall that curved tighter than it looked, so he kept close to it and let the angle reveal itself. Theseus set a loop around a pillar base and walked on, counting the loop as a fixed point that would not slide or trick him later. He came to stairs that broke into 2 flights and chose the one running beneath the floor, since higher steps invite eyes while lower steps invite fewer. Theseus measured his strides along the lower corridor, then fixed another loop on a ring set discreetly near a seam because one measure anchors the next. He clipped a tiny notch with the blade on a jamb, just deep enough to be honest, and the soft scrape told him the mark was there. Theseus came to a place where 3 choices opened, but the middle arch bore recent work by its neat seams, so he took the left instead. He thought of Daedalus setting that neat path for confused feet, and he refused the invitation, because easy lanes close on themselves when pride leads. Theseus advanced 5 turns, set a loop, and returned 2, making sure the line never crossed itself, since crossing tempted tangles that would cost him strength. He kept his pace even, and he let the numbering of steps do its quiet job while decisions came one at a time. Theseus stopped once to settle the coil, checked the last knot and walked on, with the sense that he was moving along lines someone had drawn long ago. It may not have seemed like much then, but each loop fixed a promise that the way back would be as dependable as the way in. The line grew longer behind him, and the hand that carried it worked without fuss, because practice made a motion steady when thought might wander. Theseus found a place where a low beam forced him to bow, and the thread tried to catch the notch, so he eased it and freed the snag. He knotted a reminder there to test on his way back, since careful people allow for tired minds just as they allow for broken stones. Theseus turned a pair of counter-twists that would have reversed most men, and then set another loop, smiling slightly at how the line behaved. A faint smell of stale straw reached him from ahead, which told him that something kept to a stall or chamber in the deeper range. Theseus did not hurry at the hint, because haste trips over its own laces, and he cared more about soundness than about reaching a mark quickly. He laid another loop, fixed a lock turn, and tested the pull from behind, making sure that Ariadne's first knot still owed him a firm answer. Theseus checked the torch and the blade, then checked the coil, because attention repeats on purpose when mistakes will cost more than time. He had tied the thread, faced the first choices, and kept his course through the tricks, and now the passages signaled that the plan was working. Theseus carried a steadier purpose than when he started, and he knew the center lay closer than the door that still held the line. It would not be long before the path stopped turning and asked him to use the blade for more than marks. But that belonged a little ahead. We keep the pace steady here, because steadiness carried him better than any sudden move could. At a broad junction set deep in the underways, he stopped and looked at the lay of the corridors, then settled himself on a low step to think. Theseus let the thread rest across his knee and held the coil without tension, because sometimes a good path needed a quiet minute to become clear. He pictured the palace above, the sleeping rooms and the courts, and then pictured the lines below, as though both were parts of one straight plan. Theseus believed that Daedalus enjoyed building choices that seemed many but were fewer, and he decided the true line would begin to show by its sober consistency. He remembered Ariadne handing him the thread and the blade, and he remembered the even way she chose her words, which carried no boasting, only a clear wish. Theseus set his palm on the step beside him, and the stone felt steady there, as if the ground approved a simple plan carried out with patience. He thought of Aegeus by the seawall, of the black sail and the white, and he kept that promise in its corner, ready but not distracting. Theseus rose and gathered the coil, because rest had done its job, and the same careful care would now carry him the next measure inward. He had found his rhythm within the maker's game, and the line at his back turned the puzzle into plain work that a man could finish. Theseus took the left way out of the junction and kept to his numbering, because familiar steps repay patient men, and he intended to remain patient. He moved on with the blade ready for its time, with Ariadne's plan in hand, and with the center drawing nearer in the hidden heart of the maze. We would keep company with him still, but for now the steps were enough to carry his steady purpose forward. Chapter 6. Horns in the Dark. He stepped from the last stair into a level stretch, and the line in his hand stayed straight, which told him his wandering was nearly done. Theseus kept his palm low against the stone, not to test it, but to keep his course set and steady as he moved. He carried Ariadne's blade in his other hand, and he measured his steps so that his breath did not quicken before work began. The promise to Athens came back to him without effort, for the names of the taken had ridden with him all night. Theseus did not speak them, yet he remembered their faces as a kind of company that would not leave. He had kept the youths behind him on safer ground, and he had told them where to wait until he returned. The line that Ariadne gave him lay sure between his fingers, and he trusted it the way sailors trusted a familiar current. Theseus took one more turn and eased his shoulders, because there was no wisdom in carrying tension into a hard meeting. He understood that the center would not greet him with ceremony, so he did not ask for signs or send prayers into the dark. A faint animal smell rode the still air, and he accepted it as the plain notice that he had come to the right place. In that quiet stretch near the heart, the passage widened into a low chamber where the walls drew back and left a working space. Theseus paused at the edge of it, because a small pause helped the mind fall into order before the hands had to act. He thought of Daedalus, who had planned turns that folded on themselves like careful knots, and he respected the skill without letting it slow him. The center of such a place was often simple, he knew, since complication stood guard outside and left the heart bare. Theseus traced in his head the short path he could use to circle, and he noticed where the line would lie safe from his feet. He did not lay traps or favors, because time worked differently down there, and plain work usually carried a man farther than cleverness. The old tales that reached Athens had always called it a monster without measure. Yet tales made a habit of stretching a thing they feared. Theseus kept that in mind as he shifted his grip on the blade and gave the line a little slack he could recover later. He had not come to admire a puzzle, nor to curse it, but to finish the one task that held all others in place. We keep the pace steady here, because steadiness was all he needed, and the grit under his sandals reminded him to set each foot down with care. The Minotaur waited inside that chamber, not circling, not hiding, but turned half toward the entrance as if long custom had taught it where footsteps would appear. Theseus counted the reach of those horns with his eyes, and he marked the weight in the creature's shoulders which would make the first charge heavy and straight. He took in the way its legs set wide, the way a bull steadied itself before a push, and he understood that sidesteps would matter more than speed. Theseus had put on no armor that would slow his turn, and he let his cloak hang loose, because a loose bit of cloth could drag a gaze for a moment. The Minotaur did not speak, of course, yet its patience showed a long life inside a single habit, fed and set again by keepers who never changed their ways. Theseus did not grant it hatred, for hatred fogged the eye and added clumsy weight to a wrist when a wrist needed lightness. He thought briefly of Aegeus on the shore, then set the thought aside without guilt, since a crowded mind often missed the simple opening. The blade Ariadne had given him kept its quiet, and he felt how a clear tool waits without demand until the hand is ready. The creature lifted its head once and stamped, and he judged the space between them one last time so that his first move would not waste itself. Its breath reached him in slow, warm pulses, and he took that warmth as a mark of distance and timing rather than a reason to hurry. First, Theseus shifted left by half a stride to draw the gaze and the head. Then he dropped his cloak and broke right with the blade kept low. The Minotaur came on with the drive he had measured, which put its strength straight ahead and left the turn to a later thought. If a later thought came at all, he did not meet it with a full stop, because men who set themselves like walls often snapped under a bull's weight, so he yielded just enough and let it pass. As the shoulder moved by, Theseus set his hand on one horn, not to hold it, but to mark the creature's circle and make it spend time it did not plan to spend. He stepped with that circle, counted 3, and tugged the horn down as his other hand rose, which shortened the head and opened the neck. The blade moved in a line he had trained 100 times, from back to front with a small lift at the end, and he kept his wrist easy. The creature bucked and tried to stand high again, and he followed by staying close to the shoulder where a rush could not grow. When it swung, he let go and gave ground by 2 steps, so the horns cut through empty space that would have been his chest. Theseus closed again on the next breath and repeated the work, because one clean pattern served better than many clever ones under strain. The horn felt ridged and solid in his palm, and he used that sure grip as a hinge around which the rest of the fight turned, until the heavy body sagged and stilled. So Theseus had entered, reached the center, met the Minotaur, and struggled until he held the advantage with a simple, practiced line. He did not shout or lift the blade high, because noise and show had no place in that room and no purpose for those he meant to save. He stood with the fallen weight close to his feet, and watched the great chest settle down from rough motion into nothing, and he kept his count slow. Theseus waited longer than pride would have liked, since a quiet head checked its work before it spoke of it, and a quiet head did not rush. He set the blade on the floor for a moment, freed the line from any chance of snag, and drew it back through his fingers until it lay straight again. In that small act he returned to the plan Ariadne had trusted him to carry, which brought his thoughts back to the people who waited in the passage behind him. Theseus looked once at the body and understood that the years of tribute had ended at that spot, with no trumpet and no witness other than a man and a dead thing. He did not make a speech to the dark, but he bowed his head to the memory of those who had not walked back, and then he turned to practical steps. The air felt cooler on his face, and the coolness made the room seem wider now that movement had stopped. It may not have seemed like much then, but that careful pause let him keep his balance for what followed, because work still waited in the turns beyond. In the stillness that came after the struggle, Theseus gathered himself in small, orderly motions that kept the mind from drifting into tales about what had just been done. He coiled the line back into a light tension, set the blade where his hand would find it without looking, and rolled his shoulders to ease a pull. He thought of Ariadne again, not as a picture in a story, but as a person who had placed trust in his way of doing things. Theseus did not know how Knossos would change when word travelled, yet he knew what Athens would gain when the ship crossed water with different news. He understood that the creature had lived by the pattern set around it, and his own work had been to end a pattern that had hurt many for too long. Theseus had not come to judge the people who had made that pattern, only to break it, and he would carry the cost of both knowledge and action. He breathed, and let his thoughts find their simple order again, which was to follow the line back, gather the waiting youths, and leave quietly. The faint smell of dust hung in the chamber, and he accepted it as the last common thing he would remember from the heart of that place. He did not hurry, for there was no need, and he chose steady steps because steady steps had brought him here and would take him out again. When he turned at last toward the passage, Theseus kept one memory of horns and weight, then let it rest, since the next part of the work asked for a clear mind. Chapter 7. Thread to harbour, night to sea. He stood in the same passage where the struggle had ended, and he reached for the line that waited where he had tied it. Theseus pinched the thread, and felt the rough fibres bite lightly across his fingers, and that simple touch told him the way home. He turned to the boys and girls who had waited behind him, and he said they would move, step by careful step together. The youths watched Theseus nod once, and they trusted the gesture more than fine words, because their strength had been spent inside waiting. He gathered them by pairs so no one wandered, and he handed the line from palm to palm until it passed to the last. Theseus spoke the simple plan again, pausing at each fork, and his voice kept close to names, calling each in turn to assure them. He mentioned Ariadne as well, reminding them of her help, because keeping the living helpers present made the path feel more solid. Then he moved, and they moved, and the line guided them from turn to turn, while the carved corridors kept their patient order around them. Theseus counted intersections under his breath, and he marked a few scratches where needed, though the thread kept them sure without fresh signs. He kept an eye on the youngest, and he asked the strongest to flank the group, so no one lagged or surged ahead without notice. It was late night in the palace grounds when Theseus guided the group to the outer steps and steadied them on the flat stones. Ariadne stood in the open, hands tight at her sides, and she met them with a small breath that settled once he nodded. He kept them close to the wall and spoke in short phrases, because long speeches frayed attention when simple directions served the purpose. She pointed toward the path that crossed the courtyards to the harbour, and she said their window was narrow and should be used. Theseus thanked Ariadne, and Theseus set 2 older boys near the front, and he asked 2 others to keep the rear ordered. The servants who had favoured Ariadne stepped out from an alcove with a basket and a cloak, and they passed them over without fuss. She had asked them earlier to leave those things quietly, and she offered the cloak to the youngest girl who seemed very weary. He measured the distance in his mind and timed their movement with the turning of shifts. We keep the pace steady here, with simple timing. Beyond the last courtyard the sea made a steady hush, and that sound gave the line of their escape a simple, calming direction. He turned to Ariadne once more, spoke her name with care, and said the rest would come in order if they kept moving. The group had people enough to make a little company, and each person had a part that night, however small it might appear. Theseus kept the centre, steady with the thread around his wrist, so anyone who wavered found him there and steadied themselves again. Ariadne walked near the front, quick with directions and courtyards, and she knew the path better than anyone else in that company. The pilot from their Athenian ship waited where she had told him, a careful man who had bargained for a watch post near the quay. He had a stout oarman at his shoulder, and 2 younger sailors nearby, and his name could be kept simple tonight, just the pilot. Theseus greeted the pilot with a brief nod, and set the plan in a few words, and the pilot understood, because old mariners liked brevity. Damon, a broad-shouldered youth from the group, agreed to carry a rope coil, and Melody, a quiet girl, held Orion's offered basket. The servants who favoured Orion would hang back and scatter, because their work was here, and safety lay in being unnoticed. It was not grand, but it worked. The pilot checked the tide and the wind with a glance toward the open water, and he tapped the oarman's elbow to keep him ready. When he lifted the coil, Damon felt tar cling to his palms, and that small stickiness meant the ship's gear had been freshly tended. First they crossed the last open space between palace and town, moving like a family group, because uniform motion drew fewer curious eyes than haste. Then Ariadne led them along a narrow lane where merchants kept shut doors, and she kept them close to the walls with a firm hand. Theseus passed the thread around a pillar at the last corner and tied it off, because they would not need its guidance outside the maze. The pilot signalled 2 sailors to move ahead, and they loosened the mooring knots that still held the Athenian hull against the quay. Damon and the oarman lifted a gangplank, and Melite followed Ariadne aboard, while Theseus counted heads again and gathered the last in. The pilot stepped to the tiller and swiveled the rudder with care, and the hull eased away from the stones without scraping or fuss. 2 sailors bent to the oars and worked an even rhythm, and Theseus stood near them until the bow pointed toward the harbour mouth. Ariadne went to the prow and watched the channel, and she called the turns in a calm voice that kept the line of movement steady. The oars creaked in a slow, familiar way, and that sound helped the youth settle, because tempo became reassurance when words were not enough. Once clear of the inner basin, the pilot asked for the small sail, and Damon and Melite helped raise it as they had been shown. With the sail drawing, the ship moved at a quiet pace along the coast. and the pilot kept them just far enough to avoid patrol craft. Theseus stayed at the mast and watched the shoreline fold behind them, and he leaned once on the spar and let his muscles rest. Ariadne sat near the prow with Melite, and the two spoke of simple things, like bread, water, and the tasks waiting when light returned. The pilot came to Theseus and said pursuit might come with dawn, or not at all, because news travelled unevenly through any household that large. He answered that they would keep their course and take what came, because the first part was done, and the second part required patience now. They had traced the line back, brought everyone out, and slipped from Crete with Ariadne aboard, and that was the simple truth achieved. The sail bellied once as the wind settled into a steady direction, and that pull along the cloth told them the boat and night agreed. Theseus asked the pilot which island offered water and shelter without too many eyes, and the pilot spoke of a stop that sat quiet in season. Ariadne listened and nodded, and she said a pause would settle nerves and allow small repairs, and no one disagreed with the sense of it. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later, because a simple pause could shape the tone of whatever followed. As the ship held its course, Theseus thought of Athens, and he measured the long line from the maze door to his father's house. He had promised a sail change with King Aegeus, and he shaped the thought again, because promises grown in urgency often needed repeating. Ariadne rested with her head against the rail for a time, and Theseus noticed the way worry eased in someone when a plan held. He knew the youths would carry the night with them for years, yet he also knew the worst of the story had ended beneath the palace. The pilot moved along his familiar checks and small habits, and those steady routines calmed people more than speeches, which served well in that hour. The stars lay quietly above the mast, and their fixed marks had steadied sailors longer than anyone could remember in that sea. Theseus tucked the thread into a pouch, and kept the blade near, and he kept both aside, not as charms, but as tools that had served their day. Ariadne spoke about the turnings they would face beyond the water, and he agreed, because choices did not stop when a monster fell. He reminded himself to sleep in turns and let the pilot guide, since strength kept by resting often made the next stretch smoother for everyone. So the ship moved along, and the company moved with it, and the end carried in their hands began to change into the beginning of return. Chapter 8. A quiet parting on Naxos. They reached a low island after nightfall, and the ship eased into a small cove where the shoreline sat open and plain. Theseus stood near the prow and watched the anchor line settle, while Ariadne waited beside him, steady and quiet after the hurried escape. He had led boys and girls from Crete, and they sat in small groups, looking for a level patch to rest their legs. The crew worked with simple care, and the captain, who knew these waters, judged the cove safe enough for a short pause. It settled like a pause between long tasks, and no one hurried, because haste had carried them far enough for one night. The sand felt cool underfoot when Theseus stepped ashore to look for firewood, and Ariadne followed him a little way toward the scrub. Theseus thought of the promise to his father, and Ariadne thought of the road ahead, because plans meant comfort after sharp fear. The Minotaur lay behind them, yet its memory did not close fast, and he knew that victories sometimes weighed as much as losses. He stayed near the youths, and she stayed near him, because they both understood that care sat beside leadership on nights like this. By the time the tasks settled, Theseus had chosen to let them sleep ashore, and Ariadne agreed, trusting the little cove to hold them. Morning came over Naxos, and the group stirred in slow order, while the ship floated nearby with her mast a simple marker. Theseus walked the beach and counted heads, and Ariadne checked the water jars, steady with a habit learned from long palace corridors. He knew they needed food and clear plans, and she knew that clarity made people calm, so the talk stayed small and practical. A narrow path ran up from the cove toward low trees, and Theseus sent 2 sailors to climb it and watch the island from there. Ariadne asked for a small fire to boil grain, and he agreed, because a cooked meal kept people steady during a wait on shore. Light gathered along the water in a thin band, and the cove looked held, as if the day respected their need for rest. Theseus watched that band and judged the shape of the day, while Ariadne stood beside him with her thoughts kept close and careful. We keep the pace steady here, because haste after danger often brings needless turns, and the young needed a plain, ordinary morning. He sent word that no one would push off until the sun rose higher, and she nodded, accepting that patience served them better than pride. Theseus carried the final coil of line to the stern, and Ariadne carried the empty sack, and both of them stayed near the work. Theseus looked older after the night below the palace, not in years, but in the settled way a man holds himself after hard choices. Ariadne looked younger than her rank, yet her eyes held steadiness, and she kept near the survivors like a sister who understood their needs. He had the blade she had given, wrapped now in spare cloth, and she had the small bundle she had taken in her hurried leaving. Theseus wore travel clothes and a captain's habit of scanning edges, and Ariadne wore a simple dress chosen in the rush out of Knossos. A light breeze moved Ariadne's hair as she spoke to him, and he listened, calm and careful, because clear words mattered more than speed. Theseus thought of Aegeus and the sail he must raise for a sign, and Ariadne thought of a new city where she would be a stranger. He weighed the safety of the group and the route home, and she weighed the change she had chosen, and the dependability of promises. Theseus kept track of sailors speaking about charts and landmarks, and Ariadne noticed the Athens youths practicing names for a future welcome. He noted that the sea allowed them this halt, and she noted that the island offered room to think, which meant planning could be plain. Theseus asked for her thoughts on the next day, and Ariadne spoke of temples, ships, and time, plain things that steadied people more than grand vows. The choice about Naxos formed during that morning, and Theseus measured his duty against his promise, while Ariadne measured her path against his needs. He had the ship and young lives under his hand, and she had a future that relied on his word, which weighed on them both. These spoke first about safety, and Ariadne listened, because safety for the rescued youths came before any other plan that moved hearts. He said the island offered shelter with people and temples, and she said she could wait and follow later, if the sea routes allowed. Theseus looked toward the ship and then back to Ariadne, and he chose a simple answer, one that placed the group above their hopes. Ariadne understood him and nodded, and she kept her face still, because steadiness protected pride better than tears on a working shore. The shore stones felt cool beneath her sandals as she walked a little way inland, and he watched her steps with a careful gaze. Theseus gave orders to bring the boat around, and Ariadne spoke to the sailors about supplies, making sure the work covered any awkwardness between them. He offered her the blade for safety, but she left it with him, saying the tool belonged with the thread's companion, which he accepted without fuss. Theseus stepped back toward the waterline, and Ariadne remained on the beach, and their eyes met once more, plain and honest, then turned away. By midday the ship moved again, and Theseus set the course with the captain, while Ariadne became a figure small against the island shore. He stayed at the stern and marked the distance on the chart, and she became a note beside a name, recorded carefully but placed behind duty. He had killed the Minotaur, followed the thread through the turns, and led the youths out, and then he had left Crete in the dark. Ariadne had helped him with thread, a blade, and calm words, and he had promised her a place, but duty pressed from another direction. The rope left a faint roughness on Theseus' palm as he steadied the tiller, and the ship held a slow, honest line forward across the water. He judged the weather and the time needed to reach the next stop, and he spoke with the captain about water barrels, wind, and ordinary safety. It may not have seemed like much then, but this steady work would carry him to the last stretch near Athens, where memory waited. Theseus checked on the rescued youths and told them plain things, and they listened, because practical talk let their shoulders settle without showing weakness. He asked a boy named Melas to watch the bow, and he asked a girl named Phile to count the oars, keeping them close to the routine. By evening the crew settled into a rhythm, and the captain nodded to Theseus, who nodded back, and the night promised careful, uneventful travel. When darkness settled again, Theseus stood with the captain and looked along the wake, thinking about how choices link together and push a day forward. He carried the Minotaur's end like a steady weight, and Ariadne's absence like a different weight, both set against the hope of home. Theseus told himself that care for the rescued youths came first, and he repeated the order of tasks, because order kept doubt from spreading. He thought of Ariadne on the island, and he wished her fair shelter and good company, and he kept his gaze on the simple work. The stars looked small and cold overhead, and he took that sight as a reminder that a person guides best when he accepts the scale of things. He remembered how Ariadne had given thread without ceremony, how Daedalus had built the maze, and how the youths had followed him out without complaint. Theseus held those pieces together in his mind, and he marked them as a kind of ledger, with names and deeds kept in steady order. He knew that Athens waited with its own needs, and he knew that his father watched for sails, and both thoughts shaped his next miles. Theseus kept an easy count in his mind, and he stood there until the stars turned a little. Then he went to speak with the captain. By choosing a plain path through that night, he allowed the story to move homeward, and he accepted that each gain leaves something set behind. Chapter 9. A black sail at the home shore. The coast rose ahead as the ship held its line, and work went on with the easy rhythm of practiced hands. This oar stood by the mast and spoke softly to the helmsman, marking shallows he remembered and the landmarks that guided their turn. He had his eye on the harbour and on the crew, and his mind kept returning to the safe tying of lines. The chosen youths clustered near the rail, and this gripped a post while Melanion counted the strokes that carried them closer to home. They watched Theseus, and Theseus glanced back, nodding to each by name as if to anchor them to the deck and the present. No one spoke of Ariadne or the island, and the name of Crete sat quiet as a bundle tucked beneath the benches. Agathos waited somewhere beyond those low hills, and the thought made Theseus straighten his shoulders and check the gear again with steady hands. He had made a promise, and the promise seemed simple now, only a white sail to raise when the stone headlands came near. The crew kept their course, and the mast stood firm above them, and small tasks filled the space where worry might have taken hold. Only the faint cry of gulls drifted ahead, and it seemed to Theseus like a sign that home would soon appear. By late morning they rounded the long arm of Sunium, and the familiar line of Attica opened as the coast drew a steady grey line. The temple on the headland kept its white watch, and the road to the city ran inland along scrub and stone with a tired bend. Theseus pointed once toward a cove and then corrected, and the helmsman eased the rudder until the prow lifted toward the main harbour. The black sail still hung where it had been set at Knossos, and no one thought of the bundle that held the white within reach. They had trimmed lines and set casks tight, and they had counted heads again, and those simple checks filled the crew with relief. These so spoke of dock fees to the oldest sailor, and of the quickest messenger to send to the palace when the mooring was secure. He meant to change the sail when the harbour stone showed clear, and he meant to change it when the first house roof came close. Each time another thought brushed it aside, and Theseus nodded to a rope, or he answered a question, and the moment slipped away. We keep the pace steady here, and small duties can nudge memory off its sensible mark. The water shone hard and bright under the sun, and the sight steadied everyone aboard with the simple thought that storms were behind them. King Aegeus kept his habit of climbing to the high rock when tribute ships were due, and he had done so again that day. He was not young, and he carried worry in his posture, but he had a careful way of looking long before deciding anything. Beside Aegeus stood an old friend from the council and a runner who could bear word down to the harbour if joy or loss appeared. Below them, along the path, women from the weaving quarter had paused their work, and a priest from the harbour shrine waited with a small clay jar. These were Athens' watchers, and they knew the custom of sails, black for mourning and white for a promise fulfilled, plain enough to read. On the water the crew worked without thought of colours, and the helmsman trusted the line of the reefs more than any sign set aloft. Theseus moved from bow to stern and back, carrying the coil of spare rope he liked to keep in hand, and the companions watched his steady way. It may not have seemed like much then to watch a man's calm on an ordinary approach, but it mattered later. The black cloth above them showed no tear, and it looked dull against the light, which made it easy to overlook its meaning. Up on the rock, Aegeus fixed his eyes on that square, and traced it with his hand as if to be sure it was true. First, the king spoke a few low words to the council friend, telling him what he saw, and the runner lowered his head in respect. Then Aegeus named the promise he and Theseus had made, and he said the sign had come back wrong, and a father's mind could not change it. He moved toward the edge with that deliberate care elderly people keep, and he stopped where the rock sloped down and showed the full reach of sea. The stone felt cool beneath his palm, and Aegeus took a long breath, and he let the breath go, and the council friend said his name once. Aegeus looked back down the path where a nurse from the palace had climbed to bring water, and he raised a hand to greet her. He spoke only a few words to the priest, asking that proper rites be kept for the youths and for the one he thought lost. Then the king stepped forward and let the rock and the air take him, and the sea received him before any message could run down to the shore. Far below, the ship kept her course, and Theseus called out the turn, and the helmsman smiled because the harbour mouth had never looked so clear. A boy coiled the stern line, and a girl folded spare cloth, and the companions spoke of home bread and beds and the gate they would pass. No one aboard lifted a head to the cliffs, and no voice reached them from above, and time went on as if nothing had changed. When the prow touched the quay, the first news reached the deck, not as a shout but as a steady word from a shaken dockman. The council friend had sent the runner, and the runner spoke the king's fall, and the harbour priest set his jar down on the stones. Theseus stood very still, and the helmsman put a hand to his arm, and then Theseus looked up at the mast and saw the black. He gave the order for the white at once, and the youths hauled it out, and the cloth rose aloft, too late to speak to the dead. Aegeus had kept the promise in his own way, and Theseus had failed the sign, and both truths settled on the crew at the same time. He asked the priest for the place where the body would be brought, and then he sent 2 companions to the cliff with coverings and cords. In brief, he had sailed to Crete, slain the beast, and steered home, and yet he stood in harbour with a fresh grief born of a sign. Theseus walked the dock to the steps that led upward, and he paused and leaned against the wall, then turned back to set duties in motion. He named guardians for the rescued youths. He ordered rites for Aegeus, and he asked the harbour men to keep the quay clear for those who mourned. A single bell from the city shrine sounded across the water, and its slow note told the truth that a homecoming had turned into a passing. By nightfall, the city took in its new shape, and the council spoke softly of succession while the people carried lamps along the lower streets. Theseus went to the place where the body lay, and he set his hand on the wrappings and he said the words the priest gave him. He did not speak long, and he did not shift blame, and those who heard him understood that a promise kept poorly still bound a son. The companions who had faced the Minotaur stood with him, and each one felt the turn from adventure to duty mark them in a quiet way. Theseus thought of Aegeus on the rock, and he thought of the black square above his own head, and he took that picture into himself. In time he would sit as king, and he would end the tribute and set new rites, but that night he learned the price of missed care. The sea outside the harbour kept its long name after Aegeus, and the people spoke it with a kind tone when they told children about the day. Theseus did not turn from that story, and he did not hide from the fault, and he let it sit beside the victory in his mind. The evening water held a dull sheen, and it reflected a ship's lantern in a broken path that Theseus watched until the last flame went low. He accepted that the Minotaur's end carried this cost, and he kept still with it, and so the way into kingship began without celebration. Chapter 10. Rites for the living, names for the lost. He stood where the hill fell toward the harbour, and Theseus looked across the water and felt the new weight settle without fuss. He had come ashore with men carrying their oars, and he had climbed to the place where Athens watched itself, plain and quiet. Theseus did not speak of the black sail when the elders met him, because he knew each face had already carried that sight home. He listened first, then he named the loss plainly, and he named Aegeus, and he did not turn away while the words pressed against his throat. Theseus understood that a king began not with banners, but with a small, steady honouring of what could not be undone. He thought of Ariadne in that island dawn, and he set her name beside the others in his mind like a simple stone. Theseus kept the Minotaur close as a fact, not a tale, because the city held faces that had been spared and faces that had not. He also understood that the ship had come back, the beast had fallen in its own turns, and the tribute had ended for good. Theseus let the salt in the air sting his eyes, and he breathed once, and then again, and he felt the path ahead draw out in plain steps. He began to choose those steps one by one. In the days that followed, the city moved in slow circles, and Athens found a sober rhythm that did not strain itself. Theseus sat with the council in the shade of a portico, and he listened while old men named custom, and young men named hunger, and mothers named their children. He asked the scribes to bring their tablets, and he asked the heralds to wait, because he wanted the words to be right when they went out. Thus walked the streets without escort, and he counted doorways and wells, and he heard the distant tapping of hammers where a broken railing got mended. He went to the shore where the black sail had been seen, and he stood with sailors who had learned his name on that voyage, and he said less than they expected. Theseus ordered the place where Aegeus had fallen to be marked, not high, not bright, just clear, so a passerby would know a father had stood there. He also sent for the priests, and he asked for quiet rites that would sit alongside the louder feasts, because not every grief liked noise. Theseus said that the sea would carry Aegeus's name in the mouths of sailors, and he did not argue about whether that name would spread or stay near. He kept his hand on the rail as he spoke, and he paused often, because he had learned that pauses sometimes carry more than speeches. We keep the pace steady here, and he kept it steady there as well. He gathered the people who could hold pieces of the work, and Theseus gave each a clear task that fit the hands offering to help. There was Philemon, who cut timbers and measured keels, and he spoke with calluses rather than claims, and he said he could build a training craft for the rites. Theseus turned then to Myrrhine, who kept the small shrine by the lower fountain, and he asked her to keep a list of names and to teach the children how to say them. There was also Dymas, who ran messages between farms and city, and he knew when to ride and when to walk. And Theseus told him to carry the word that no tribute would be sent again. He named Hestiana, who had lost a son on the second year of the sending, and he asked her to choose a place for the wreaths, because she knew the path a mother's foot would take. Theseus brought in the wrestlers and the runners, and he told them to help plan games that would honor strength without cruelty, and he made sure the stakes were simple. He also asked the singers to learn a plain chant that would hold the story without sharpening it into pride, because he had no patience for boasting around this matter. Theseus set a small chest in the council room, and into it he placed a bronze disc cool to the touch, a marker for each youth lost, and he asked that it never be emptied. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later, because it gave the hands something honest to hold while the minds worked. First came the ending of the tribute in simple words. and Theseus sent 2 ships with fair crews and clear letters to Crete. Then came the setting of the memorial stone for Aegeus, and he asked that no garlands be left there except on a quiet day each year. Theseus spoke to the shipwrights, and he asked them to rig a pair of sails for the training craft, one white and one dark, so the lesson would repeat without injury. He worked with the dancers, and he had them fix a rope in the public square to wind around as they moved, a thread to teach the turn and return. Theseus set a law that on the day of their safe homecoming each year, youths who came of age would walk with elders who had outlived children, so the city would meet itself. He asked the carvers to raise 2 small horned posts at the field's edge, not frightening, only clear, where the wrestlers would pass them before matches, remembering the cost of strength. These kept the priests to simple prayers, and kept the merchants from making the rites into wares, because he knew how quickly a lesson turned into a stall. He arranged for a boat to circle the bay with the white sail lifted and the dark one lowered, so the oars would find a calm rhythm alongside the memory. These also set aside bread and oil for the households that had been hit hardest, and he hid that charity inside ordinary errands, so pride would not be bruised. During the first dance, the steady tap of small drums kept the steps gentle, and he watched the rope's coil loosen and gather like a line someone could follow home. The people took to the new ways without strain, and Theseus saw how a repeated act could hold the mind when words grew thin. Mothers who had stood alone began to share the wreath place with neighbours, and boys who had been spared learned a short bow before the horns and the rope. Theseus went each year with the sailors to raise the white sail high, and he let the old mistake sit there in the open light, not hidden, not mocked. He let the singers lead a chant that named the Minotaur only once, and then moved on to the names of youths, and then to the simple thanks for safe returns. Theseus also kept his eye on the crews, and he made sure the strongest men had patient partners, because he had learned that courage without steadiness broke more than it mended. The games ran plain and kind, and if a match ran too hot, he stepped forward and cooled it with a word, because he knew what heat could do. Families ate sweet honey cakes after the rites, and he stood with them without ceremony, and he tasted the same sweetness, because small comforts had their place. So the Minotaur was dead, the tribute was ended, and Aegeus was gone, and the city learned to carry those facts without letting them harden into pride. Theseus understood that the thread Ariadne had given had become a way of walking together, step by step, and he felt that was the best of it. What lasted would be simpler than his battles, and others would carry it after him without needing his name on their lips. In the quieter years, he kept a small length of cord in a drawer near the council bench, and Theseus would hold it when choices tangled. He did not speak of it often, and he did not let the story turn into spectacle, because he preferred a city that learned in ordinary ways. Theseus kept the memorial small and clean, and he visited it on clear mornings when the soft lamplight still clung to doorways and made the stone look plain. He said Aegeus's name first when the rites began each year, and he waited for the answer in the voices, and he heard the strength there grow steadier. Theseus honoured Ariadne's kindness by making the rope dance simple and honest, and he honoured the dead by keeping the lists dry and complete, with no missing lines. He also honoured the living by ending all sending of youths to foreign anger, and by teaching his captains that victory without mercy emptied a house faster than any tax. Theseus grew older with that pattern in place, and he felt the burden sit easier because it had been shared, and he knew that was the point. He saw children trace the horn posts with timid fingers and laugh because the posts were small, and he let the laughter stand because fear had had its share. Theseus sometimes stood again where hill met harbour, and he thought of the black sail and the white sail, and he nodded once to the way they had become teachers. He understood that stories stayed only when they fed the living, and he had chosen to feed them, and that was how this tale kept its use. And so, dear knight, our tale of Theseus and the fearsome Minotaur comes to an end. May your rest be peaceful, and may your dreams lead you safely through every labyrinth. Until our next story, ride onward beneath the stars. Good night.